So I'm excited to be here today because it is Autism Acceptance Month, and I actually think we should be celebrating, not just accepting autism. It is, I'm going to talk about, we've been doing this at Spark since 2016, so we've got a bit of time under our belt and we've made a lot of progress, and I wanted to share the progress that we've been making with all of you and with a large community of researchers. So in doing this, I think we've come a long way, but we have so much farther to go in terms of our understanding, in large part because of the complexity of autism. Everyone's not the same, and that's a wonderful thing that we're different, but being able to understand that means we're actually understanding several different types of autism, essentially. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. Let's think about this in detail. We have one name, autism spectrum disorder. I personally don't love that name, but some people have called it that. But I think the point that I want to emphasize in this is that it's a spectrum, right? And so just like many of us are a spectrum in multiple ways, let's think about autism in terms of the spectrum. Some individuals have real challenges, and the term has been used, profound autism. Individuals who are nonverbal, who may have self-injurious behaviors, who may have really significant problems in terms of day-to-day independent living, and may have some medical issues as well, things like epilepsy that are going with that, or seizures. Within that same umbrella of autism, though, are individuals who are profoundly gifted, really unique in terms of the way that they see things. And because of that unique perspective, really are able to do things, be creative, have insights, be able to contribute in unique ways. And within this, it's just hard to talk about everyone in the same breath with a single umbrella term of autism. And so what we've done in Spark is trying to make sure that we leave no one behind. It is hard to be inclusive of that entire spectrum, but that is what we're trying to do as we leave no one behind. To do that requires, therefore, very large numbers, because as we start to stratify, or as we start to divide people in multiple different dimensions, and I'm going to talk a lot about that today, different dimensions of whether or not be sleep, and who has issues with sleep, or who has issues with anxiety or depression, or problems with attention. No one person has all of the issues that are shown on this slide, but when we start to divide out who might have this challenge or that challenge, we need to focus on those individuals. And so we need really large numbers, especially as we think about additional factors like age. Autism for a 3-year-old is different than autism for a 30-year-old in terms of the day-to-day challenges and the day-to-day opportunities. And so we need individuals across the lifespan. We need individuals of different sex. It manifests, as we're going to be talking today, differently in males and females. And with this, as we think about how to best support people so that they can be the strongest and best version of themselves, we need to have different ways that we're supporting members of our community. So it's with that we really thought about being able to bring Spark together. That is, that we were going to need to have a large number of people. And in doing that, in some cases, we were going to need the power of everyone together for some studies. And in other studies, we might need to focus, as I'm going to show you today, on a certain portion of the lifespan. So maybe focusing on adults and what's different for adults. In doing this, therefore, the numbers that we're talking about, and when I say large, I'll show you in a second, the numbers are not just large like 100, the numbers are large like 100,000. And in doing this, it really allows people to also contribute on their terms. And so we realize that when it comes to life, life can be busy. Sometimes as we give research opportunities to people, it just might come at a bad time of the year. It might come at a particularly stressful time. And so we also want to be able to do this on your terms. We want you to be able to have the convenience and the luxury of participating in the types of studies that are meaningful to you. And so we give you a variety of options in doing this. As we do this, we, though, want to make this easy for good researchers to do good studies that are going to benefit our community and eventually lead in a concrete way, although maybe not tomorrow, but long-term, lead in concrete ways to improving lives. And so that's why we've put the community together with this. So let me start with one of the questions we've thought about in Spark, because many, and this, I have to say, the research agenda is in part shaped by you, shaped by the community of what you care about, what you're interested, the questions that you ask us. we try to be able to flip that around in terms of getting data from the community to answer your questions. And I will warn you, we don't have all the answers, but we are making progress. So one of the first questions is the why question. It's a question I, as a doctor, get asked all the time. I was seeing patients all day yesterday, and I got that the question was asked to me at least a dozen times by a dozen different families of the why question. Within this, sometimes we have some answers and insights. I will say the majority of times we still don't, but we are chipping away. We're making progress. I'm not going to talk all about genetics today, but as a geneticist, I will spend a little bit of time at the end of the webinar talking about updates of what we know about genetics and what we still don't know. We are making progress, and in some cases, I do think we can identify for an individual family a major genetic contributor to autism. Within this, as I'll show you, it's not so simple. It's not always one single genetic contributor, but we're starting to understand that better. But it'll sound sacrilegious, but even though I'm a geneticist, it's not all about the genes in one person and across communities. And it's hard to be able to turn back the clock in some cases 20, 30 years to think back about times during development that might have been critical times for exposures, things that might have happened during pregnancy with a mother who might have been sick. And I'm not saying anyone's to blame, don't get me wrong, but where it coincidentally was a mother who had a viral illness where that virus may have led to some inflammation or use of medications. And we don't always know what the factors are, but we, in some cases, do see an increased frequency of some of those factors at a population level with an increased frequency of autism. There may be certain specific medications. We do know, for instance, of certain medications that are used for epilepsy, valproic acid, or conversely, vitamins and prenatal vitamins in particular. Folic acid is one that we think about a lot in terms of fetal development and the role that it has, could play a role in certain individuals. The bottom line, though, is for many of these factors, even the ones that have good statistical confidence that, again, across a population may be accounting for some increased probability of autism, for any one individual, we oftentimes don't know still the answer for this particular person, that why question. We may realize that there are even a probability of a contribution of multiple factors, but maybe not one single factor. So as we've thought about this, again, we've tried to be able to bring this together to be able to improve lives. And as we think about the causes, as I'll show you in a second, there may be different, as we think about prognosis and associated features, to the extent that we can get down to specificity, again, not just at a population or a group of individuals, but if it's all about you, and being able to understand how to support you or your child going forward, we need to have increasing specificity about what are the things for you individually, for your child individually. We're all working together, but we're eventually trying to bring it back to the individual person. So let me take some information that's been in the news recently. There are studies that are done in the United States around the Centers for Disease Control, and they are periodically looking at the frequency of autism in the community. They're trying to do this again as a part of the U.S. public health system to monitor trends and things that may be changing over time. So the most recent numbers have come out relatively recently, and I'll show you a graph over time, but it is showing that the numbers are more frequent now than they were the last time they did this measurement. Then these are by looking at sites that are stationed around the country, so it's not based on any one hospital or any one state, but actually a series of these that are monitored over time. And the frequency has increased over time in general. I'll show you this in just a second. But importantly, something happened with COVID, and I know everyone's COVID burned out, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But what you can see is right when the pandemic started in March 2020, that's the red bars that you're seeing below the line, there was this period of time where services and things were shut down. And so there is, and I think this is true of all segments of society, we were turned upside down and on our heads. For a number of children, especially young children that were seeking a diagnosis. There were delays to diagnosis during that period of 2020. And you can see the teal bars coming up. We started to catch up in the summer and into the fall and are still catching up from that. But there's a cohort of younger children that will have grown up diagnosed later due to COVID. And that's one of the things in Spark we've had the ability to do is real time to be able to monitor what's been going on as that effect has been seen writ large across the country. We're seeing other things that we've known about before. So we've always known that autism is more frequently diagnosed in boys than in girls, but the numbers are a little bit shifting in favor of girls. I'm going to talk more about girls and females over time. And as we're looking at the data, it's also important, I believe very much as a pediatrician, that we don't leave anyone behind, that it's important in terms of making sure that we've got equal access to diagnosis. And that's what this starts out with, is the diagnosis, and then ultimately equal access to services, that we're able to help all young people and all adults. So this is showing on the x-axis along the bottom here the year. So you can see starting at the year 2002 and then coming up to the most recent data. And the different colors here are representing individuals by self-identified race and ethnicity. And so what you can see is that at the beginning, autism was more frequently diagnosed in individuals who are self-identified as white. And so you can see in those yellow sort of little dumbbells, the yellow dots and dumbbells were on the top. But one of the things that you can see in the most recent data is the yellow is actually at the bottom across all the different rainbow of colors. Although the numbers are increasing for all of the groups over time in a good way, and I really do think this is good. Other groups that have been historically underrepresented, so individuals who self-identify as Black, Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, or even multiple races, are getting more access to diagnosis. And in fact, you can see the frequency of the diagnosis, even more frequently diagnosed than individuals self-identified as white. The other thing that people ask me about all the time, seeing these numbers go up, and you see actually a big jump up for some of the groups in the last survey, is this, an outbreak? Is there what's going on in terms of, is there something in the water? Is there something in an exposure that's happening over time? And I will say that I think for the most part, this is due to recognition. This is due to more access to diagnostic services. This is more recognition of being able to get the right diagnosis, and with that, being able to get the right services. So I don't think there's been a huge shift in terms of environmental exposures, something on block in society. It's not like a certain region of the country had a certain exposure and changed this. These are trends that we're seeing across the country. So in Spark specifically, that's taking data from the United States. In Spark specifically, what have we been able to do since we started in 2016? A shout out, we have over 30 clinical sites around the United States. Again, Spark is a US-based study, who are incredible centers of excellence, who day in, day out, literally someone I feel is like always on call at the clinical sites, working with individual families and communities to be able to make life better. With this and that partnership, it really has been a partnership with the community. We're now, if I tick up the numbers actually as of this very moment, about 125,000 individual participants with autism in Spark, and those are divided out in terms of about 80-20, individuals who are not yet 18 versus individuals who are over 18 or adults. And so in a good way, a representative group, or at least a group that we have large numbers of across that age spectrum. With this, though, we don't limit this only to individuals with autism, but also their family members. That's in part because we learn things from their family members. We learn about differences in other family members. We learn about genetic analyses, and we use this, as I'll be showing, in some of the ways that we look at the genetic aspect. But with this, just to remind you that the majority of what I'm going to be showing you about today in Spark is not related to genetics, but it's about the community of researchers who have performed over 200 research studies now that are in what we call research match. And so with that, they're using us to be able to send an invitation to you, and then you can vote with your feet in terms of deciding which research to participate in. And with this, I'm going to show you some of the results of their work. I'm really proud of what we've done together, and I want to emphasize that because these are really good researchers who have good ideas, largely powered by the community input that they've received from you. You as participants in terms of giving of your time and energy, and then together with a community advisory council and participant advisory council that help to be able to make sure your voices are heard in these research studies, collaboratively together being able to do the best research. And with this, we're coming up to one of our international autism research meetings, and I can say that Spark is extremely well representing your voice and your research at that meeting. With this, there are a certain fraction of the community that's participating in research studies, not everyone, and that's perfectly fine. I wanted to give you an update that we've been working very hard to make sure that everyone is in the process of being sequenced, or in fact has been sequenced. For many of you, about 8 to 9% of individuals right now have received an alert about having a genetic result. I will say that this alert comes to the email that you registered in Spark. So if there's an email that you don't check very often, I'll just ask you to go back and check in or go to your dashboard on the website because there may be a result sitting there for you, and we want to make sure you have access to that. I'll get into the results a little bit more, but we've been going through and doing advanced genomic studies to do this. And within this, for some individuals, I think had a really meaningful impact. I'll get into those different impacts. In all cases, it's always up to the individual family and participant about whether they want that information. And again, all of this is done at the Spark expense through a study genetic counselor to be able to explain all this information to you and think about how you can use that for you and your family. As we've done this, we've tried to give back, not only in terms of the genetics, but as you're participating in research, whenever possible, to give you information personally about yourself or your family member, then also as the study is done, be able to give you back information about what we've learned. We've done this, and I'm doing this today in terms of this webinar. We do this sometimes through our newsletter. We do it sometimes through what we call snapshots to be able to have something that's relatively easy, I hope, to digest and absorb. And in some cases by our researchers doing webinars, just like I am today, talking to you, hopefully making it accessible and understandable. And we're committed to continuing to do this over time within Spark, just to say that we have lots more to do, and we're doing more of the same, except hopefully better as we grow and as we continue to get into deeper questions. With this, we think it's important to share as a community, and so we love sharing your stories, and we have feature writers for Spark that if you ever want to go on the website, you can be able to go back and see both the videos as well as newsletters that our writers have written. Let me give you a couple examples of the snapshots. One of the things is that sometimes it takes us a while to get enough data to be able to come up with a snapshot. So for some of the portions of our community that may not have numbers that are as large, it takes us a while to be able to get good, really accurate information, because we want to make sure that we are giving you an accurate picture. So we've had a couple of snapshots recently that have been very popular, and I think are ability to be able to learn more. And one of them we've done is focused on the African American and Black community, so those individuals who self-identified in that way. As we did this, and it's always important to me to be able to understand the lived experience for individuals, as they reported to us some of the factors or exposures or things that had happened over life. Interesting that there was a fair number of individuals who had birth complications or prematurity. And this is something that we see in general in terms of access to care and prenatal care and obstetrical care. And so this was important for us to see this and see how this may be related to autism down the road as we're seeing this. Also, as we're looking at this, being able to understand some of the features, and I'll get into this a few times today, but shown down here in the lower left, some of the differences between children and adults, and in some cases, some of the same things. That is seeing the frequency of different co-occurring conditions, things like sleep problems, quite prevalent, even more prevalent in the children that were, or the minors that were surveyed here, but I'll get back to sleep again, a significant issue. Other issues that I'll be getting to later today, also issues with attention, cognition, anxiety or nervousness and depression, things that all sort of blend together in terms of the brain and behavior. And so this ends up, as I started out saying, being complicated. I don't think too complicated to understand, but complicated to be able to get right. We've gone and looked also at females, women and girls, and I think Spark has been really important in terms of being able to get that voice out there. It's different. The experience for women and girls is different, and so I think it's important. I'm going to come back to it, but the way it gets manifest in terms of what other people can see on the outside is different. The way people feel on the inside is different, and so the challenges that go with that are different. I think it leads to it being underdiagnosed because it may not be so visible. It may not be as eruptive. You may not see it in terms of a tantrum or, an outburst, but yet it's not to say that it doesn't have significant impact on the inside. And so a lot of that in terms of especially the anxiety, some of the feelings of depression, are something that we're really seeing coming out in the women and the girls. And with this, increasingly, even individuals in adolescence or young adulthood that may not have received the diagnosis before, but as they're able to understand themselves better, as they're able to see other examples of other women and girls out there who do have a diagnosis, and to be able to do some of those comparisons, being more reflective and trying to understand themselves better, in part so that they can do better, so that they can get the tools they need to succeed and being able to get supports. And so I think we're seeing this especially in Spark. We have an interesting overrepresentation of adult women in Spark. And so I think this is actually important in terms of allowing them to have their voices heard, being able to be part of the answers in the future. And I take this as a sign that they feel a need, both, I think, it is true that women do like, or at least are more likely to participate in research generally, but also in this research in terms of being able to make a contribution and move the needle forward. I'm going to focus a little bit on the return of genetic results, and this is showing, these are by month since we started doing this, the number of genetic results we've returned. The ones in blue are representing results related to autism, and we've been seeing that in about 8 or 9% of the participants. And then starting about midway, or rather at the end of 2021, started returning some results that you see here in orange, only for individuals who requested this information, but things that are not related directly to autism, but things that as a doctor, I felt very strongly about giving back to the community if they wanted them. And that's because these were medical conditions where we could have information that could be life-saving for you or for families. Things where there might be a high likelihood of something like a cancer diagnosis for a cancer that was preventable. And I wanted you to be able to live full and healthy lives. And if I had something that I could give you to do that better, to be able to avoid cancer, avoid something like a sudden heart attack or a sudden stoppage of the heart or an arrhythmia, I wanted to make sure that you could be empowered to take care of yourself and take care of your family. Now, thankfully, this doesn't happen very often, so I don't want you to panic. I don't want you to get nervous, but we are returning, as you see over on the right, what we call secondary findings, things that are not the primary goal of what we're doing in Spark, but we wanted to do right by you. And so again, if you have one of those results, we'll be communicating with you through the email that you sent us, so check your inbox and check your dashboard. Okay, let me switch gears and tell you about some of the research match studies that have been going on. With this, I'm going to highlight the researchers who are scattered around the country, many at Spark clinical sites, but many not. And one of the important things that was led by Eric von Braun and Brian O'Rourke was to validate that what you report is actually correct. And I'm very pleased to say I never had any doubt, but there are some people that give us a hard time as researchers saying maybe people aren't self-reporting accurately. So Eric and Brian went to the trouble of confirming by doing a medical record review of some cases of individuals who are in Spark to make sure that you reported it correctly. And I'm very proud to say, yes, in fact, you did. Reported certain things very, very accurately. And there were certain things things that I have to say I've learned that I think it's our terminology that we use that may not resonate and may not be quite clear enough. And so things like a definition of intellectual disability or an IQ less than 70 rather, about 70% of parents or individuals correctly self-reported, but a few individuals, about 30%, there was a discordance or a discrepancy between what was reported and what we saw in the electronic medical record. Now, I'm not surprised by that. Again, most people don't go around thinking about, well, what's my IQ score and is it above or below 70? But on the other hand, we've learned that if we ask very specific questions about functionality, then that operationalizes very well. So we've learned to do that during Spark, and we've gotten better as we've done that. One of the other things is that there's a strict research definition of what autism is. And so there's a diagnostic tool called the ADOS, which is shown over here on the right, that's often used in terms of trying to decide, should someone qualify for research in autism because you have an official diagnosis, a research reliable diagnosis. On the left are what people that are in the community with a community diagnosis, or what we in Spark call a professional diagnosis. And one of the things that you can see comparing males in blue and females in red, comparing the left to the right, is that for females in particular, there's oftentimes pretty good concordance in the community between, or pretty good similarities in terms of males and females and being able to represent those cases, whereas on the right with the ADOS definition, females very much became underrepresented. Females didn't necessarily meet the diagnostic criteria of the ADOS nearly as frequently as the males did. And so this again leads to this male-female dichotomy where we have fewer females then who are potentially represented in the research if you have to have that ADOS to get into the research. And so again, I think we're going to be thinking about how we define it and what the flavor is for females. This study gets into thinking about along the top. Each of the column is looking at different risk factors or exposures that are associated with autism. And this is to try and get at understanding, might there be a profile that would be different based on the exposure? And that exposure could be the timing during gestation and postnatal life that may affect different parts of the developing brain differently. And again, even within any one of these columns, it's not to say that everyone's exactly the same, but you can see by this what we call heat map, different along the rows here are different symptoms or different manifestations. Then you can see that they cluster in certain ways. And so things that are darker colors, darker red in particular, is more frequently associated together. And so that you can see, for instance, in fetal alcohol syndrome, the third column from the left, that seems to be associated more with certain features, very hot for separation anxiety, bipolar, conduct disorder. So you can start to get a flavor that there may be different subtypes by etiology. Again, it's not necessarily 100%, but things that are much more common. And so I hope, again, we can start to see some of these patterns. We do have patterns that are quite complicated. And this group at the National Institutes of Health used the power of two of our cohorts at Safari, Spark, which I'm largely talking about today, but also a cohort called Simon Searchlight, which is defined by genes that are associated with autism. And with this, each one of these sort of groups is a different motor milestone, a different milestone of development that children achieved. And you can look at the general population, which is called normative data. You can look at average for individuals that may have been on time in white with the sort of hashes less than 6 months delayed, or in black, 6 months delayed or more for that milestone. And you can see that for the general population, most people are on time. For Spark, you can see a few people, 13, 14% of individuals might be delayed by a few months. But then once you start to get into these genetically defined groups, depending on which gene it is, and I will emphasize it does depend on which gene it is, you may see many more delays, more significant delays in particular. On the other hand, with this, we can get more specificity so that, for instance, the specificity, if you have a 1q21 deletion, is very different than if you have the lowest one here, the PPP2R5D. And so getting that specificity helps families in terms of thinking about expectations or prognosis. In thinking about this, sleep is a big issue. I can say for myself, sleep is a big issue. And we realize, though, there's a complexity that comes with sleep with the individual with autism. There's also the dyad or the triad of the caregiver as well. And so one of the things that we can realize is that there's sleep quality in the child that can affect the strain on the caregiver. That's a direct positive correlation that the worse the sleep quality is for the child, the bigger the caregiver strain. As you see that, you can also see that with that comes an issue in terms of the caregiver also potentially not sleeping as well and affecting the caregiver's quality of sleep simply because life is upside down. And that can have this circular effect in terms of just putting a lot of strain on the family in general, and perhaps even making things more difficult from a behavioral point of view for the individual with autism. So sleep is an issue, and we're going to be delving deeper into understanding sleep, and potentially if we can help sleep, maybe we can help some of the behaviors as well as quality of life that comes for the whole family. With this, we also realize that there are differences between individuals diagnosed as children or less than 21 in this particular case versus those diagnosed after the age of 21. And so when you think about what are the features and what are the characteristics of those individuals, we do tend to see that at least a portion of the cohort diagnosed under the age of 21 also had issues that were related to intellectual disabilities, some significant developmental issues, whereas other individuals diagnosed over the age of 21 weren't coming up on the radar as readily. And so they may have had different manifestations, but again, been under this umbrella diagnosis of autism. So for those over 21 in this top half that you're seeing over here, more, and this is when you see an odds ratio or OR greater than 1, it means that it's more frequently associated in the individuals over 21. And so you can see in the adults diagnosed, more issues of anxiety, social anxiety or social phobia, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression or dysthymia. So all of these more frequent by comparison to the ones who were diagnosed before the age of 21. Now, on the other hand, more frequent in those diagnosed younger, less than the age of 21, for instance, are things like oppositional defiance disorder, and seen in both groups are things like attention deficit disorder. And so with this, you can see that there's some things that are shared, but some things that are different depending on the profile, and that profile to a certain extent associated with the age of diagnosis. Individuals have, as I was pointing out, issues with mental health. And I think one of the opportunities that Spark provides is the opportunity for many researchers to think about this and replicate the findings of each other in a different way and to be really solid in our understanding. This is a study looking also at co-occurring symptoms of attention as well as depression and dysthymia, and looking at differences by sex, so males in blue, females in red, and looking at whether or not it's associated with cognitive impairment. So cognitive impairment meaning things like intellectual disabilities or significant problems in terms of issues that are related to sort of functioning, daily functioning from a cognitive point of view. So for those individuals with no cognitive impairment, you can see that there are things that are different between males and females. And you can see that for those individuals, for instance, who are verbal, the ones who are in the lighter shades, there's an increased frequency of attention issues, both in males and females without cognitive impairment. On the other hand, we can see, for instance, that with, and the same thing with depression or dysthymia on the right, a little bit different in terms of more females without cognitive impairment, and with full speech, more dysthymia in females, but we can see both issues both in males and females. On the other hand, when we look at issues in terms of cognitive impairment, we can see more issues in terms of ADHD, slightly more issues with ADHD with those who do have cognitive impairment compared with those individuals, for instance, who don't. So again, we're starting to see slightly different profiles. One thing that I think is really hard is what I think of as inner psychic pain. And with this, we do know about depression, and that can be associated with suicidal ideation. Um, in the group at the University of Iowa takes this very seriously and has been looking at this both in the general population of those individuals who don't have autism on the left, as well as those individuals with autism. And the thing that you can see on the right for those individuals with autism is how much higher that percentage is of individuals reporting suicidal thoughts, something we really need to pay attention to. Broken out by those individuals who have average IQ or exceptional IQ, those you can see even an increased frequency for those individuals who are gifted or talented and have exceptional IQs. And so with this, just realizing that it's, again, the feelings can manifest in different ways and they're very, very serious. And so it's something, as we think about supports for individual, again, we need to think about how to do them, tailor this based on what the unique features are. As we think about the life course, it's not only sort of above the shoulders in terms of the brain and behavior, but it's really about looking in toto for also some of the physical and medical aspects as well. And so the group at Vanderbilt has looked at this in adults and thought about ongoing care, ongoing medical issues, access to care, and thinking about how this is manifesting and differences that we see by males and females. What you can see is the females here in purple and the males in green. And you can see for almost all of the symptoms that are reported that they asked about, females tend to have more symptoms than their male counterparts. So that's one of the first take-home messages. The other thing you can see is sleep again. So down at the bottom here, you can see just how frequent sleep is in terms of being an issue. So again, I'll come back to it. We hope we're going to, at least as a community, think and take seriously sleep. Fatigue, though, also another issue in terms of thinking about this, but also some other issues in terms of gastrointestinal issues, constipation, diarrhea, other things in terms of nausea, gas, and again, other intestinal issues. So with this, also important, I think we're going to need to work as a community to have healthcare providers who can take good care of our individuals as they're aging up and have these really, medical issues that we need to take seriously. With this, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to buzz ahead, but to say that we've also been realizing that lived experience, as I said, is different for different members of the community. Looking at specifically individuals who are Black or multiracial and looking at the table over on the right in their survey responses, you can see how many people noticed a difference in terms of the diagnostic process, how they would have wanted to have a faster diagnosis, how they wanted people to take them seriously, just having professionals listen to them. And even, I have to say, having your support, your own ecosystem of your family and other people really there to be able to support you as well. And so with this, it's something to continue to work on. But as we're thinking about this and thinking about gaps we can fill, it becomes clear that this is an important one. Okay, so let's continue onward, and I am going to spend just a few brief minutes talking about genetics, because I know some of you are interested in this particular. I'm going to spend some time at a high level helping you to think where we are in terms of our model of understanding genetics. And it's complicated because within this sort of spectrum also of genetics, there are some factors that are relatively big contributors and others that are smaller contributors. So the genetic results that we're returning right now through Spark are these on the left, what I'm showing you as a visual. This is meant to be a cup of water, and these are meant to be ice cubes of different sizes. And so Spark largely can recognize factors that are genetic variants of large effect. So it's like having a large ice cube in your cup of water. And for someone to receive a diagnosis of autism, they have enough water and enough ice where they go above this line. We think of this as a threshold. You can get above that line either because within the same amount of water, because you have one big ice cube, two medium-sized ice cubes, or a bunch of little ice cubes. Any one of those combinations, you can theoretically get above that threshold or above that line. We are able to recognize at this point, based on our limited understanding of science, we are most readily able to identify these big ice cubes, that is, genetic variants of large effect. And that's because in the general population, they're not very common, and so we can more readily pick them out and recognize them. And in many cases, they are new in the individual with autism, and we can very easily recognize things that are new in the individual when we're able to compare both the parents to the individual with autism. And that's the reason why we include this as a family affair for families who want to participate that way. On the other hand, we realize that not everyone has one of these genetic variants of large effect. In fact, it's only about 10% that we currently recognize. I'm sure there are others that we don't recognize yet, but we're still learning. On the other hand, we are just barely starting to see some of these medium-sized ice cubes. We're getting a large enough number of individuals where we're replicating the findings. We're seeing them over and over again and able to be more confident of these when we see them. And I'll show you this briefly. But also to realize that in many cases, there are smaller genetic variants. There are variants that have smaller effect, I should say. And in some cases, it's a combination of these genetic variants that are each small. And in some cases, just to make it complicated, it's all of the above. It's some small, some medium, and some large, and all of that put together. And so again, with the ability to have some of the best scientists all working on the data in parallel and replicating their findings, we've had a lot of fantastically hardworking people working for you. Jonathan Sabat and his group have looked at this and really had models to be able to think about these coming together, both these large ice cubes and the small ice cubes. And not just that, but thinking about how sex comes into play and how there may be differences between males and females. In general, females are more likely to have some of these larger ice cubes when they have a diagnosis of autism and intellectual disabilities especially. We've also had individuals at the Broad, led by Mike Talkowski, who have looked at these and done a lot of things now, thinking about not that everyone has autism, but certain individuals who have autism also have developmental delay or a history of intellectual disability. And so he's used some information from other researchers who have been studying and focused mainly on intellectual disabilities and developmental delay and brought the power of those two groups together. And as he's done that, he's realized that the genes that we see associated with intellectual disabilities are ones that are very, very active early in fetal development. So they're from the very, very beginning and have sort of a more global effect, as opposed to some of the other ones that are more specific to autism are involved in the brain development later in later stages of development. He's realized that there's quite a bit of overlap between the genes associated with developmental delay, about 500 of those so far, and the genes associated with autism. In his calculation, about 183 of them. There is quite a bit of overlap between the two, but it's not 100%. Our own group here with Dr. Pamela Feliciano has also looked at some of these medium-sized ice cubes and identified 5 genes that are those medium-sized genes and realized that in some of those cases, those genetic variants are passed down in families, and in some cases they start brand new or are de novo. And in some genes that we've seen before, that ratio is such that it's mostly ones that are passed down, shown by these big blue bars here, and some that are mostly de novo or new, shown by the red bars here. And for some genes, as I said, it's a combination of the two. In one person, it might be passed down. In the other person, it might be de novo. And that's in part because there are different variants, even in that same gene, different variants between families, and they may behave differently and be associated with slightly different manifestations, and be that, for instance, epilepsy or other associated features. As we've done this, we've also realized that there's quite a bit of, as I said, heterogeneity, even with individuals who are within the spectrum. And so we've realized that there might be certain features, certain things that might be repetitive features, social communication, that might be modified by some of these little ice cubes. So I'm showing you down here to, again, that visual cue. There's some of these little ice cubes that might be kind of adjusting a little bit how the manifestations are of a big ice cube, as an example. And so it takes a combination of the big ice cubes and the little ice cubes all together to be able to show us what the manifestations are going to be. So where are we going in the future? Very quickly. Well, we're going to continue doing Research Match. We still have many, many more questions to answer. And as we're doing this, we continue to have more researchers who we work with to make sure their research questions are good, to make sure that they're phrasing things in a way that's concordant with the community and the language that we use. And as we're doing this, giving that information back to you so that we're learning together. We're committed to understanding the multiple dimensions, and we realize that it's complicated, but that's why we have such large numbers of you, and we have a fair number of us to be able to work on this together. We'd love to hear from you both today and always in terms of what questions are pressing and important to you and how those might be changing over time. And as we're doing this, we realize that we're not finished yet. We need to follow individuals through the life course. It's important for us, especially to make sure voices are heard after they turn 18, that those individuals can for themselves participate as adolescents and young adults, that we don't lose people so that we know how things turn out over time. And that as we do this, we're inclusive by people, rural versus cities, individuals who speak Spanish versus English, based on the color of people's skin. We want to make sure that everyone's represented because that experience is different. As we're doing this, we are, again, de-identifying the data, but making sure that many people can access and use the information because the more people that work for us, the better. As we do this, I do hope to get to more of the specificity and be able to think about over time, what can we do for someone when they're a young person that will help them when they're older. With this, we need to continue getting people across the age spectrum into Spark, especially young people, young toddlers and preschool children. So we'll continue recruiting throughout the lifespan, but especially in terms of some of the younger people. So as we do this, we are continuing to iterate, and I hope that with your help, we'll continue to get better and better over time. So let me stop there and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was great. And it looks like we have just a little over 10 minutes for questions, which is great because we had some great questions come in. So sort of I'll go a little bit sequentially with the way that you presented the talk. So you started today's talk, you presented some of the new CDC findings. And actually just yesterday there were some news, yet again, new CDC findings about the prevalence data that states that profound autism makes up 1 in 4 cases in children with autism. So just how do you think these findings could maybe support future research and the lives of those living with profound autism?
Yep. So this is a really important point, and language matters. And profound autism is incredibly important and different from the lived experience with individuals that might be in other places in the spectrum. And so I think it's important for us to recognize that. I think from a nomenclature point of view, I have to say I've been talking about how this is so complicated because there is a spectrum, whether we call it profound autism, if there are others that, want to have to be able to say, because profound autism really, to me, signifies individuals, for instance, who are nonverbal, who really have profound impact in terms of their lives. That number, that some people have called historically other things, intellectual disabilities as an example, or and ID or intellectual disabilities is not exactly equivalent to profound autism, but in terms of these things, you get the gist that it's more sort of one end of that spectrum. For those individuals where we say there's autism writ large, it's about a quarter of individuals who go into that category of profound autism. I will say that for those individuals, lives are very, very complicated and very difficult. And at least for many of the families that I talk to, they have a different set of priorities. They have a different set of challenges. And I think they look to different supports and long-term ways of being able to cope and deal with that and really go from hopefully being, what can be even a daily or moment-to-moment challenge to being able to improve quality of life in many, many different ways. So with this, I think it's just important to be respectful of the difficulty that we have in our language, and hopefully someone's going to come up with a better vocabulary of this. But I do emphasize that in Spark, we don't want to leave anyone behind, and we do want to make sure we've got those quarter of the folks with profound autism that we're paying attention to. Many of those do end up having some of those genetic diagnoses that I explained that we're returning, and then support those individuals through Simon's Searchlight and other programs that we have at Safari, but also making sure that we, are respectful of individuals who are at the other end of the spectrum as well.
Great. And thank you for that. And another question that came in from a handful of people is related to twins and also multiple pregnancies. And so I know this is something that you've talked about in other talks, but can you speak about any research findings for twins or multiple pregnancies and how that can be a contributing factor in autism prevalence?
Yep. So twins are complicated, as you were alluding to, Dominique. We've done a better job obstetrically in terms of getting twins to term, but it used to be the case that we weren't so good at doing that, and twins were more associated with prematurity, and prematurity is actually one of the risk factors for autism. In addition to that, there are differences in twins just simply by whether or not they're identical twins or fraternal twins. And so even though there's the same shared intrauterine environment, it can be variable in terms of the genetics being, again, identical twins, 100% identical versus sharing 50% of the genes like any siblings do. With the twins, in terms of that shared intrauterine environment, sometimes there can be an exposure that could be, as I said, an infection, something else that complicated the pregnancy, a medication that's taken. And so if you look at the probability of one twin, one what we call fraternal twin or non-identical twin having autism, and then the other twin, that probability is higher than if you took two siblings that were not in the same womb at the same time, suggesting that there is something about that shared environment. And it kind of tells us even what fraction of the variability might be due to that. So there clearly is something about sharing the environment that's not just sharing the genes, but sharing the environment as well. The other thing about identical twins is that identical twins share same environment and same genes, but even that's not 100%, right? You would say, well, if it's, all of those factors, it should be 100%, but yet there are differences. And in some cases, it may be because after they're out of the womb, there are things that are uniquely different in terms of exposure to one twin versus the other. So it's complicated even in the simplest sort of circumstances where nature has just had certain circumstances where some things are more comparable. We do sometimes find, though, that in those twins, it may not be autism per se, but sometimes one of the twins will have one behavioral diagnosis and the other twin another behavioral diagnosis. So it may not be autism exactly, but there may be other challenges that are manifesting in just slightly different ways. And so to me, speaks to how some of these behaviors are complicated and they're not sort of completely distinct. They're sort of side by side and can manifest slightly different times at slightly different life stages and in slightly different ways.
Great, thank you. And then going back to one of the studies that you covered, I think this is an interesting point that somebody wanted some clarification on in the Fambone ADHD study. Can you just confirm if the group of participants is ASD individuals, and is the study stating that 40 to 45% of comorbidity of ADHD in autistic verbal individuals, like that is the who was used for this study?
Right. So these were autistic adults in Spark.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for clarifying that point. And then another question, this one came in from Facebook, actually. So is it more beneficial for genetic testing of autistic children's siblings or both parents? Like what would be more beneficial to, I believe they're asking, what is more beneficial to determine if a second child would have autism, by testing the sibling who's autistic or testing the parents? It's a tricky question, but I think it's getting back to that pregnancy question you were answering before.
Okay, so sometimes the question comes up for parents who have one child with autism, whether or not another child will have autism. So empirically, without having any other information, and if we just take it, like I said, the number is 20%. So if you've had one child with autism, the probability of having your next child is going to be 20%. And that probability is slightly higher if you have a male rather than or compared to a female. To know, for instance, whether or not there's something genetic and if that number might be higher or lower, the genetic analysis, which I alluded to, for people who want to do that, would include genetic testing of the child with autism and both parents. It would actually come as a package. That helps in terms of recognition of the genetic factor, and it also answers more directly this question of recurrence. That is it likely to happen again or not? If it's found that this is a de novo genetic event in the child with autism and not seen in the sample from either of the parents, then it is very, very unlikely it'll happen to the parents again for that specific genetic factor. That number is about 1% that it would happen again. And so for some individuals, it's like, they might have thought, oh, it's 20%. Now I did genetic testing. Now it went down to 1%. So that's really good. I feel more confident about this. Those types of parents where that genetic factor is identified tend to be the parents of children where the child also has intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, perhaps some other significant medical problems. They tend to be more of the individuals at the more severely impaired part of the spectrum.
Great. Excuse me. And then with our last couple minutes, this is actually a Spark specific question to participating in Spark. So how can participants receive secondary results if it's not something that they originally were aware of or originally requested at the time when they joined?
Right. So I know for many of you, it was a long time ago when you went through this, but in the consent, you had the ability to consent for various results to be returned. And then as we're doing the secondary findings specifically, we're going back to sort of jog your memory and ask you again if you'd like that information. And so with that, again, the big thing is to be able to look at your dashboard or look at your email, because we're using the email that you gave us when you registered. And if that's one you don't use very often, there might be something sitting in your inbox.
Great. Could probably squeeze in one more question since we have a couple minutes and we did get quite a few questions. Are you, and this is more study specific as well, this seems like a good note to end on. Are you aware of any similar organizations like Spark, similar studies for people not in the United States? Or are there any other organizations that are even just working with as many people as us at Spark?
Yep. So some other studies that are not exactly like Spark, but there are several in Europe and in Scandinavian countries that have a very different study design, but that do have studies that are population-based studies looking at autism. So they're complementary is the way I would describe it. There are other places around the world that have parts of Africa, parts of Europe, parts of Asia that have cohorts. I don't know if any of them the size of Spark is, to my knowledge, at least we're the largest of these studies. And I think there's some unique features of what we have that allow for reciprocal interchange, probably more than some of these other studies do. But I think in a good way, your contributions are influencing how researchers around the world are doing research. So I think people I see following Spark's lead in many ways, which is good.